My name is Leon Versfeld, and we are going to explore on this webinar some options on how to immigrate to the UK. With me, I have our distinguished guests. If they can appear on video, that will be great. I have our distinguished guests from Breitenbach Immigration Consultants, our partner who assists us with all UK immigration for families and for corporations and individuals of high net worth who has the option to immigrate to the UK. My name is Leon Versfeld. I'm originally from South Africa, graduated from the University of Pretoria, ultimately ended up admitted as a barrister or advocate in South Africa and a subsequent solicitor in England and Wales. My practice exclusively focuses on US immigration. Our practice have expanded to other parts of the world where our other South African colleagues have taken on the journey themselves to immigrate respectively to other countries. Today, I have the distinct pleasure to introduce to you JP Breitenbach from Breitenbach Immigration Consultants and Dirk van Niekerk. JP, why don't you introduce yourself to the listeners real quick, please?
Thank you, Leon. You make us sound very special. I appreciate that. So I'm Jacob Breitenbach of Breitenbach Immigration Consultants, originally from South Africa as well. You guys can see a theme across the board here. I'm a UK qualified solicitor as well and practice immigration law and have done so for nearly 2 decades now, in fact. It's a privilege to be here, Leon, and thank you for everybody that is attending. Looking forward to telling everybody a little bit more about the UK immigration world and landscape, and to see how we can assist anybody.
Awesome. Thank you so much, JP. Dirk, with the last name like Van Niekerk, I'm pretty sure that you are from a suburb in London. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, thank you, Leon, and thank you for having us on. I'm not too sure about a suburb in London. I can tell you all about the suburb in South Africa that I'm from, but I'm very sure no one wants to hear about that at this stage. But yeah, I'm also a South African qualified attorney. Completed my studies in South Africa, did my articles of clerkship here, and then jumped straight into the immigration world. Joined Breitenbach's under the mentorship of JP about 5 years ago now, and now exclusively dealing with UK immigration matters. And as you'll see later on in the presentation today, a bit more of the niche stuff that I have to deal with. But yeah, that's me in a nutshell.
Perfect. I think a good start-off point, JP, is why don't you just give our audience a little bit about a background about the UK immigration system. And I may chime in from time to time just to kind of give a little bit of feedback of how things work in the US as well. But why don't you give us a little bit of background on the UK system?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll be delighted to. Thank you, Leon. So the UK immigration system is in many ways a very good system. Of course, there's a lot of faults, as with any man-made system, but the UK system, as far as immigration is concerned, so one has to differentiate between immigration as it relates to corporate immigration, family migration, matters of that sort of nature, and then of course asylum, refugee status, which is a completely separate body of law and a separate sort of field in the UK, and then finally British nationality law, which is a very complex field in the UK, given that the United Kingdom had massive empire for many years. There's a lot of ex-colonies and things like that where people have ties to the UK that sort of forms part of UK nationality law and practice, which is slightly separate. So I think the focus of today's discussion really is on immigration and what we really would refer to as things like ancestry visas. Maybe I'll touch on that, but if you're married to a British citizen, if you want to work for a UK company, or if you're a foreign business wanting to expand to the UK, how does one do that? If you're somebody who's particularly talented, as per the UK immigration laws definitions thereof, how do you go to the UK, and so on and so forth. So the basic idea behind UK immigration systems, of course, like any bit of law, you have acts that sort of come to Parliament, and and so on and so forth. But the most important bit is what's known as the immigration rules, which is a statutory instrument that really sets out the requirements one has to meet in order to be able to go live and work in the UK or join a spouse and so on. So it's a very structured system. The UK's non-family related bits of law really is codified in these immigration rules. The UK tried to sort of do a points-based system that like Australia had, but it never really never really evolved to the point where you actually get points for different things. It's more really just a way of categorizing different visas. One of the good things about the UK is that decisions get made quite quickly. When I say quickly, I mean very quickly. Some decisions can be made as soon as 48 hours. And of course, there are some other categories that take longer, but it's kind of a yes or no answer that one gets quite quickly in the process, which is beneficial. So, yeah, please go.
Yeah, so I mean, that is kind of the biggest concern, I would say, from our practice, where things are taking years for an adjudication. Sometimes something as simple as just a work authorization card that is based upon a pending application. The officer literally needs to see whether or not the application is pending and approve the case. It's taking months, 5 months. And so when you are saying that some of these stuff take 48 hours, I mean, this is almost unheard of. I wonder, what the US has done wrong, and or whether or not the volume of work may be different. That's kind of very interesting on how quickly things happen in the UK, a yes or no. Because, people can plan. Oftentimes when people embark on a journey to immigrate to the UK, the US, Australia, wherever the case may be, one of the biggest concerns is how long is it going to take? And while the thing is pending, people are halfway with one half foot in the US and half foot in South Africa, wherever the case may be. And it takes years to adjudicate. So very fascinating. I just wanted to kind of jump in there and kind of make a point as far as the US is concerned. Sorry, JP, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No, not at all. I think it's a very valid point there, Leon. It's, for example, if it's an ancestral visa, if you're a Commonwealth citizen, if you're British-born grandparents, that application, of course, you've got to meet the requirements and so on and so forth. So the presumption that all the requirements are met, you can do a fast-track application, as they say. It can be done in a couple of days. Normal standard processing time will be about 3 weeks, more or less. Now, this is very different to more human rights-based or discretionary applications. Sure. They can take substantially longer. The majority of these applications, pretty much all of the applications to go and live and work in the UK has to be done by way of entry clearance. So you have to apply from abroad in most cases, without sort of delving into too much detail there. And I think that might be why it's so much faster in many cases. It does vary from country to country. If you apply from the subcontinent, for example, sometimes it does take a bit longer. If you apply from the United States, for example, because it's such a vast country, there are many different mechanisms in which to apply. Whereas if you apply from, let's say, South Africa, for example, you either have to go to 4 application centers in the main cities, and that's pretty much the only choices you have. The benefit is then the results come quite quickly, and hopefully they're positive, right? But at least then what you're in for, and it's done either which way. So yeah, please. Yeah.
No, I just said it's fascinating. I just curious to understand, from our end as to why things are taking so long. And under the new administration, things are taking even longer because there is, it almost seems like they're going back to re-adjudicate some cases that we've done in the past, number one. And number two, it seems like there's some additional vetting going on, and that may have to do something with what happened in the previous administration. But I'm not going to get off on a tangent. This is a UK seminar, JP. So yes, please go ahead.
Yeah, I think the American system and everything to do with the states at the moment is just infinitely more complex than most other places in the world would appear. Pretty much as a layman standing outside looking in. But yeah, best of luck with that, Leon. I can imagine it must be a bit tough. Yeah. Just sort of the final point on the UK immigration system, really, just to tie it in a little bit more. There's a very defined route to settlement as well. Right? So if you are, for example, going to the UK on a 5-year ancestral visa, then at the end of those 5 years, if you meet XYZ requirements, and if you haven't broken the law and so on and so forth, you'll get, upon application, you'll most likely get your settled status or indefinite leave to remain, whatever one wants to call it, which will then make you free from immigration restrictions, and subsequently you can then naturalize if you choose to do so. So I think it is, in that sense, beneficial to know, right, this is my time frame, this is what I need to do, these are my timelines, and generally speaking, most of the time you can stick to those and move from there.
Gotcha. So tell me a little bit about some of the new upcoming changes. I understand that the immigration system in the UK is pretty evolving. There's quite a lot of changes happen. I wish so dearly that the US system would be changing. I mean, there's quite a few low-hanging fruit where immigration can be changed in the US. But give us a little bit of an update on some of the upcoming changes in the UK immigration system.
Yeah, gladly. I think maybe a very good place then to start off with, thanks to is this white paper that was published by the government in May. So in the UK, you have most of the time you have a white paper that gets issued by the government in power at the time, with sort of their proposals or their changes that they believe that they're going to be making over whatever period might be applicable. Now, any immigration matter or any immigration law, and Leon, I think you know this better than most, really is, immigration is a political football or political hot potato, isn't it? You know, so much of it is driven by politics and whatever promises were made in the previous election. And the current government came into power, amongst other things, for other reasons, of course, for some promises they made in terms of immigration and cracking down on immigration and so forth. So this white paper really is only the beginning, or their initial sort of stab at keeping their campaign promises. Now, a lot of the things mentioned in the white paper can be seen as being a bit misleading. For example, one of the things is about the massive increase in migrants in the 3 years, the last 3 years of the previous government being in power. But a lot of that doesn't say, well, that was post-Brexit. You know, the EU citizens that went to the UK before isn't really counted there. And a lot of the migrants, as they say, really were people who went to the UK to fill care worker roles, for example. Because of the EU folk leaving, there was suddenly a massive shortage of care workers, and the government made it then easier for care workers to go to the UK, and it skews the statistics a little bit. So one just always have to sort of bear that in mind. Now, one of the important things about this white paper is it's not law. So it's a proposal document. Normally, how it'll then be implemented would be by what's known as statement of changes, and we've seen some statement of changes that came into effect last week, I believe it was, and I think there are some more coming into effect on the 15th or thereabouts in July. So things have been changing, but generally speaking, from experience, I can tell you what the white paper says and what the actual law says in the end, when it's all implemented, is normally quite different. Now, a lot of the matters really that was addressed in the white paper makes a lot of sense. You know, and some of it really, for example, salary increases in some of the sponsored work routes. You know, it's the UK doesn't always keep up with inflation in terms of what the requirements are for example, income requirements when it comes to migrants. So it really is just really, I think, just bringing it into line with what the cost of living in the UK would be. It's really not that drastic. There is a skill level increase, but not massively so. In fact, the proposed new, and it has come through on the statement of changes as well, is that you have to have a degree, or the position at least has to be a graduate level position. That was the case for many years, and then that changed to below graduate level. So now we're just going back really to the way things were. For example, then on students, you know, the UK's got some of the world's best universities. They attract a lot of foreign students, but they also have unscrupulous education providers that really they provide courses, but it's not really genuine. So it's more really a crackdown on institutions, including employers, who don't really adhere to the letter of the law, but certainly not to the spirit of the law. You know, it's not really what the government meant. So they're sort of restricting that a little bit. They are at the same time looking for the best and brightest, which is a famous phrase in the UK. Dirk will speak to us a little bit more about that when we get to the global talent and the other sort of categories. One of the other categories that's always really complex and that normally attracts a lot of human rights legislation and case law is the whole thing about being reunited with your family members. You know, if you as a British citizen have a foreign foreign national as a wife, children, and so on, it can be very complicated to bring them to the UK. So there's a lot of changes that are being proposed by the government, but then is actually being countered quite heavily, in fact, by a body called the Migration Advisory Committee, which is the body that advises the government on migration. It says sort of on the tin. So we'll see how a lot of this plays out over time. I don't think there's any reason for people to panic. You know, and the other was really, it's just bringing it in line with things that make sense. For example, the care worker route, you just don't have the requirements anymore, according to the government, in any event, to have as many care workers as you had before. And the government wants industry to invest in themselves, really, for training new people to join the industry and so on and so forth, as opposed to just taking the easy way out, government, to get people from abroad to go and fill those positions in the UK. So a lot of these things make sense. How they'll be implemented and the effect thereof, of course, remains to be seen. One of the big points of contention is this 10-year timeline to indefinite leave to remain, or also known as settlement. That's raised here on the slide. Effectively, at the moment, after 5 years in the UK, you can get, generally speaking, indefinite leave to remain or settlement, and then a year later, you can apply for naturalization. Government wants to sort of increase that to 10 years. When you look at the fine print, though, they are also opening up shorter routes to settlement, depending on sort of a means test, really, that they are talking of introducing. So, and in any event, there is already, and there has been, since the 80s, a 10-year route to settlement in different categories. So again, a lot of it looks quite scary on the face of it, but when you delve into the details, it's really not necessarily something that's gonna come into play or affect many people when it does. So that's sort of the basis of the white paper. But what I would like to add is, one shouldn't just look at things like the white paper or the things that make headlines. One of the large sort of issues, or the main issues that the UK have, is undocumented migrants. You know, people crossing the channel on boats, which is a terrible thing because so many people drown. It's really quite terrible. There must be a better way, but be it as it may, one of the things that the government also announced is a dramatic increase in legal aid funding for immigrants. So hopefully, with that coming into play, a lot of the backlog of undocumented migrants or of asylum seekers or refugee folks claiming refugee and humanitarian protection will now actually be dealt with. Because otherwise you have many people who effectively, they don't have access to a bank account, they can't work, they don't have, oftentimes you have a language barrier, of course, you know, they kind of almost get lost in the system. With increased funding, legal aid funding, hopefully more of these people can get their statuses resolved and then can start contributing to the economy and so on and so forth and living a decent quality of life. So that's very encouraging, but that of course is not part of the white paper. So one has to really try and take a global look about all the various changes that the government is sort of proposing to get a feel for what they are trying to achieve over the medium to long term moving forward.
Just can I maybe ask JP as a quick update? I mean, you know, we've had a significant amount of undocumented folks coming to the country in the last 4 years, and it has caused chaos. I mean, not just for the immigration system, because there has always been certain rules that everybody abides by and so on and so forth, and then there was the separate set of rules that has kind of come into play where, you know, some people are just passing by and trying to now, at least for the next 4 years or however long this is going to take, equalize that out. Do you guys have also a huge amount of illegal immigration into the UK?
I think in comparison to the United States, nowhere near the numbers, even on sort of a parity level, you know, with a much smaller populace, of course, than the US. I think it's much harder to get to the UK, you know, being an island and so forth, you know. And also another thing that, you know, this entry clearance requirement I mentioned earlier, you know, if you are from a visa national country, you know, so you get non-visa and visa national countries. So US citizens, for example, they don't need a visa to go to the UK. They have to do the ETA, you know, notify the government effectively as part of the travel plans they're going to the UK for a visit or whatever. But many countries, you need to apply for a visitor visa. For example, South Africa, Zimbabweans, and many other nationalities. And I think it's the government's attempt to try and stop people from entering the UK in the first instance who are unlikely to leave the UK. So I think that's one sort of portion of immigration control. And also when you look at sort of deeper appeal rights and things like that, the UK legislation also generally really provides often a case of go back home and then we can hear your case to appeal. And if you're successful, then come back. Now, I'm oversimplifying that, but that's sort of a bit of an ethos there. So I think that stops a lot of people without the genuine intent just to visit the UK, to go to the UK as students and then leave as they should, to effectively become overstayers, as we say in the UK, and then to effectively become undocumented, right? So I think in that sense, the UK has got it a little bit easier. And also, there's no open borders to walk across, right? So you have to get on a boat or a plane or a train or Eurotunnel, whatever the case might be, to get to the UK. So I think it is more contained. I think that the larger problem the UK have, which they, I think, are trying to address as much as they can at the moment, is people going to the UK for whatever reason and then never leaving and just disappearing, or B, people who get to the UK either being smuggled or something along those lines. And of course, the UK, it's a hard thing to do for any government, I would imagine. But I genuinely think the UK is doing the best effort at the moment, since the current government's come into power, to try and stop a lot of these people smuggling operations as best they can, which will hopefully pan out in the long term, not only for the UK or the economy and so forth, but of course for the folks being smuggled.
Yeah, exactly. Well, it seems like everybody has that kind of issue, maybe just if the scale is maybe just a little bit different. Give us a little bit of an update on the EUSS update. What does the EUSS stand for?
So effectively, if we cast our minds back to the heydays of Europe, when the UK was still part of the EU and we had free movement of people, directives and goods and all those wonderful things, prior to Brexit, Europeans could, of course, just go to the UK and live in the UK and work as they could to any other European country. Post-Brexit, that changed, and that brought in a slew of very complicated bits of legislation to try and effectively deal with European migrants living in the UK still. Of course, there was a transition period where migrants could still go to the UK. Now, without being incredibly boring and boring everybody to death, the long and the short of it is, generally speaking, if you are in the UK as an EU citizen, so a French citizen, for example, and you've lived there for 5 years, pre-settled status, so you did your registration, so on and so forth, you get indefinite leave to remain or settled status at the end of that 5th year. One of the main issues that we've had, which the government has now addressed in this statement of changes that's on the screen now, you had to originally have been in the UK for not have been absent from the UK rather for more than 180 days every any given 12 months, right? So sort of a rolling 12-month period, which was tricky for a lot of European citizens because they just didn't know. The government didn't necessarily do the best job of explaining the law to everybody. So you'd have people who have pre-settled status but might have gone back to France and lived there for 2 years or whatever and would have broken that 180-day rule. So the government has now clarified and they've brought this in to say if over the last 5 years, you've spent 30 months, 2.5 years at least in the UK, no matter how that's been broken up or how that happened, you can still get your settled status. And that's a really good thing because it sort of, I think it's going to act as a bit of a cleaning up measure as well, because there are only so many people who will still be able to qualify for settled status in the UK as e-citizens given the passage of time. And this is a really good thing. It's going to help a lot of people out to regularize their stay and be done with immigration as a whole.
Just create some clarity with regards to where it doesn't seem to have been clarified once the Brexit exit happened.
Yeah, look, I think it was such a massive undertaking to untangle, for the UK to untangle themselves from all the legislation that, of course, they adhere to as being part of Europe. Not only immigration-wise, but can imagine trade agreements, defense agreements, all these other million and one different things. And EU legislation, European Union legislation post-Brexit, was incredibly complex. On the one hand, you kind of needed it to be because it was an incredibly complex set of circumstances. But hopefully now, with, as I mentioned, the passage of time, things will now sort of be smoothing out, and that part of that headache of for us as legal practitioners will also be a thing of the past. Yeah.
Talk to us a little bit about this very inconvenient ETA that the UK has now come up with, that all of my American friends and clients are complaining about. It's like I've never needed to use a visa or even register to go to the UK, much less needing to tell them about the DUI that I had 10 years ago, and now all of a sudden I can't go visit my Aunt Matilda in London anymore.
Yeah. Yeah, look, so the ETA is not a visa, right? But it does, I would imagine it feels like it, you know. It's really more just a notification, isn't it, really, to the British government? You know, yes, they can of course, you know, if you look at the law itself, Americans, for example, as non-visa nationals, you know, you technically get a 6-month visitor visa upon entry, right? So you fall under the same bit of law as somebody who has to apply for a visa from their country of origin or nationality before going to the UK, but it's a different process. So really all it is just a notification, you know. But I know it's annoying, but fortunately it's not a visa. You know, in the same sort of sense as South Africans, for example, who want to go watch the rugby at Twickenham or whatever, you know, have to apply for a visa in advance and wait 2 weeks, whatever, get the visa, and then go and watch the Box at Twickenham.
And I understand that since the Box became the world champion, that has become a little bit more stricter and more difficult to get those visas for South African supporters to come to England. Is that correct?
Yeah, you wouldn't believe it, Leon. You know, somebody needs to let you know. Some legislation needs to be changed on that, you know. But yeah, we'll see what happens with the next World Cup as well, you know. Yeah. But yeah, so and then sort of an e-visa. I think just to sort of clarify what that is for everybody, there's a lot of confusion between the ETA and the e-visa. Effectively, all an e-visa is, it's an electronic visa, right? So it's just part of the UK government's sort of really updating their technology, right? So you used to have a sticker visa on your passport, and then the UK went and you had what's known as a biometric residence permit card, looks like a driver's license almost, and that's now moved to this e-visa. You know, so it saves time on the government not having to get your passport, print things, stick and post them back to you. You know, it's all electronic. It's much more secure, and it's easier for everybody. You know, so that's really all an e-visa is. It's just a different method of confirmation of you having the right to be in the UK or visit the UK, whatever the case might be.
I'm truly impressed on how far advanced the UK immigration system is. We are still kind of living in the old ages. Our laws are still back in the 90s. And I think the closest that we had reciprocal is the ESTA visa for, you know, certain countries like the UK, and certain folks who are coming here to visit, only limiting them to 3 months at a time. But other countries have the e-visas too. I mean, you know, we've traveled quite extensively over the world, and some countries that do require visas, like Vietnam for US citizens, they also have the e-visa. I hope at some point in time the US will be able to kind of catch up on, you know, being a little bit more advanced and having the flexibility of e-visas, especially with the World Cup soccer being hosted here in the US and in Kansas City. By the way, there's going to be like 4 games next year, because I think I can only foresee that being quite a challenge to come to the US next year for the soccer if they don't kind of streamline things. But anyway, why don't you give us a little bit of a breakdown where we talk a little bit about options. We've got folks here that I think some of our listeners are from the US. We've got some just inherently from the last names that are on this webinar, some South Africans that are interested in immigrating to the UK. Let's talk a little bit about some of the options that some of these folks can pursue if they're interested in immigrating to the UK.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll be happy to. So effectively, I'm going to leave the global talent and some of those routes over to Dirk. So I'll just give sort of a brief overview. And of course, anybody can just contact me at any time if you've got any questions. You know, all our details will be available. But broadly speaking, you know, for the UK, of course, you've got visits like any other country, right? Go visit, you know, go watch the rugby as we mentioned, or you know, there are also other categories if you're an artist performing at a specific music festival, for example, also can fall under there. And some visitor categories you can get paid for. under very specific circumstances. As a general visitor, of course, you can't work in the UK, right? You're there to have a holiday, whatever. You know, if you represent a client in Old Bailey or something, you know, you can get a specific visa allowing you as a foreign lawyer or solicitor or whatever to go do that, even if you're not a UK national. So it is important, I think, for potential visitors to the UK to just realise you're not allowed to go work, but you are allowed under certain circumstances to earn an income there, you know, or work remotely, whatever the case might be. But if in doubt, check, right? Because it's a fine line, but the option is there. So just don't ever, as an American, for example, fly into Heathrow and then say, well, you know, you want to go, rather than get some work experience, you know, at the bar somewhere or whatever the case might be. That's not going to go down too well. As a separate side, then really as its own thing, is citizenship to the UK, right? So it all falls under, broadly speaking, nationality law and practice, and that's where things can get quite complicated. You know, but if you do have a British-born grandparent or parent or whatever the case might be, you know, and somebody potentially born in the colonies, previous colonies, you know, it gets super complicated, but there are a substantial amount of routes open for somebody to potentially get British citizenship. That is certainly not evident at first blush, right? So if there's anybody that thinks that maybe they have some form of claim, just reach out and we can look into that for them. There was a massive legislative change in July of 2022. We sort of upended the apple cart as far as nationality law is concerned quite a bit. There's a lot of legislation sort of going, trying to clarify that, a lot of litigation going on about that as well. It's really one of the most sort of complicated and influx areas of law that I certainly have ever come across, but it's certainly there. And if it's not a claim through some form of ancestral right, then generally speaking, one would naturalize in the UK after living there for 6 years. If you have, you will definitely need to remain for at least 1 year, which you normally get after 5 years, right, of living and working in the UK, for example, as a skilled worker. So that's citizenship very much in a very tiny little nutshell. Family, you know, if you've got British family, right, you want to go live in the UK with your spouse, with your children, you know, or you have a family member who might be elderly, who needs to come and live with you in the UK. There are ways of doing that. That's all sort of part of the family category of immigration law. Then you have sponsored and non-sponsored work. Sponsored work is work permits, right? So a company that wants to sponsor a foreign national to work for them in the UK. It's a very broad sort of area of law as well, with a lot of nuance and complications there. But it's one of those routes I think any country has to have it. Right? You know, you have to allow businesses in your country to be able to employ foreign nationals to go and work in that business, especially today in this hyper-competitive world that we live in. Non-sponsored work would be things which Dirk will really address, which would be stuff like the global talent or things like that, where you go to the UK based on your own background, experience, and skill set, and then you get a visa to go live and work in the UK without necessarily having to be sponsored by a UK company already established. Okay, and then finally, study. As I mentioned, the UK's got a very large number of very, very, very good universities, very popular, not only universities, also schools, boarding schools for foreign children or young adults to go and study, or adults going to do a doctorate or an MBA or whatever in the UK. Strict requirements as far as that's concerned, but a very, very important part of the UK's education system for foreign students. You also get to stay a bit longer in the UK on sort of a post-study worker type visa, depending on what category of, if you've done a master's or an undergrad or a doctorate, whatever the case might be. We can delve into that if anybody's got some more questions on that. But broadly speaking, those would be a very, very broad categorization of the different aspects of UK immigration law.
So question, is these work visas limited? In the US, similar thing, you know, people come to the US to study, great universities over here. But then what will happen is it's post-study. There's a very short period of time where they can get like a work authorization in line with what they did study for postgraduate work authorization. But the problem that we have in the US is that the typical visa that it flows into the work visa is the H-1B visa. Now, there's like 65,000 of these available. So by the time Elon Musk has grabbed his, the guys from Google has grabbed theirs, the guys from Facebook has grabbed, I mean,
Yeah.
then the rest of the world is left with whatever is left. So they have this silly random lottery system that they place everybody in, and with the hopes that your application can get selected. Is there a limited amount of work visas post study in the UK as well?
Short answer, no. So there used to be a cap for all work permits, which was
Okay.
then taken away. So there's no specific cap. I think the UK is more generous, substantially more generous than the US when it comes to graduates who graduated in the UK who wants to stay on.
Perfect.
Normally
That makes
you
sense.
have sort of a period where you can work without being sponsored, right? So,
Yeah.
let's say you can work for 12 months on your own steam. The idea is for you to then start working at whatever, PwC or wherever, you will start working, for them to get to know you better and then move on to the skilled worker category by them sponsoring you. And under certain circumstances, it's a bit easier for sponsoring companies to sponsor migrants who studied in the UK under a certain age, depending on what they studied. So I think it's much more generous. The UK does want to retain that talent if they can.
That's awesome. I mean, that's kind of one of the craziest things that we have found over here. I mean, it's the easiest way to educate the people in the US, have them graduate at the top of their class, and then say, well, sorry, you can't work over here. And then only to take all of that talent over to India or China or wherever they came from and to go start up a business over there, be competitive with the American companies. Well, Dirk, why don't you talk to us a little bit about global talent?
Yeah, thank you, Leon. I think, global talent, and excuse me if I get quite excited when I speak about these type of visas. This is kind of my department, with my practice with Immigrating does. And you'll note there on the slide that I marked this as the flagship visa, because that's exactly essentially what it is. It's everyone wants to be chasing this global talent visa and wants to have that. And the reason, therefore, is the flexibility that this visa is going to offer you. So just a bit more about what the global talent is. So you essentially have a two-step process, right? We go through an endorsement process, and if you get successfully endorsed, you will be able to apply for your visa to the UK, whether that is from within the UK, switching from another route, or applying from another country. Now, what makes this visa interesting and kind of difficult in the same matter is that endorsement process. When we look at the endorsement process, we have about 4 or 5 different endorsement bodies that we can approach. And you can only approach them in your field of talent, which is science, engineering, medicine, humanities, digital technology, and arts and culture. Now, in order for you to obtain endorsement in these fields, you need to evidence that you either already have or recognized as an exceptional talent in your field of practice, or you have exceptional promise to become the sort of expert lead in your field of talent. The important thing to notice about the distinction between that exceptional talent and exceptional promise is that you get the exact same visa, get the exact same rights in the UK. The only difference that you do have is an expedited route towards settlement, which I'll address in just a second. But if we look at the distinct advantages of this visa over any other, is the fact that you, number one, choose your own duration of your visa. And where that becomes important is when, look, if you want to save costs up front, when you look at something, any type of long-term UK visa, you have to pay upfront costs to access the NHS in the UK, which is mandatory. The longer you get your visa, the longer you apply for your visa for, the more expensive that gets up front. So to be able to choose your own duration really works in that. Then the other big advantage here is, because this is mainly a non-sponsored working visa, is the fact that you do not need any sort of job offer to go over to the UK. You don't need to have any confirmed ties. You can literally, you get the endorsement, you get the visa, and you can go and work in the UK. It's interesting that you can work in whichever capacity you want to in the UK, but you do need to remember, if you want to ultimately receive settlement out of this visa, you need to be earning money in your own field of talent. For example, I was to be an actor, and I got endorsed, and I'm going over global talent as an actor. I need to star in some sort of Netflix series there, or do some sort of contribution towards the economy. to be able to get settlement there. But in terms of the actual getting back to the visa and how we apply for it, once we go through the endorsement stage and you go through the visa, you do have you have less requirements compared to other formats. You don't need to prove English. You don't need to prove you have a set amount of funds in your account. So it's kind of an easier way to do that. It's just when it comes to endorsement, that's normally the sticking point for clients.
And who does the endorsement? Is that in the industry that does the endorsement?
Yes, correct. So when we look at the different, as I mentioned, the different disciplines that you can get this visa for, each discipline has its own endorsement body. If we look at something like digital technology, a company named TechNation considers these endorsement applications. So all documents get submitted to them. They go through it. If they're happy, they'll endorse you, and then you take that endorsement to apply for the visa. Similarly, if you do arts and culture, you either get endorsed by Arts Council England or PACT if you are in the film and television industry, and so forth and so forth. You have each and every discipline has their own endorsement body considering these.
Now, one of the glaring industries that I found is missing, and maybe it's buried or categorized under one of those, is sports. And maybe that's why the UK is not good in cricket or rugby or any of these sports, because they don't have the ability to access global talent. What about sports? Is sports not part of your global talent visas?
Yeah, look, I won't comment on that, Leon, in terms of how good their sport is or not. But no, essentially, sport is not covered under the global talent. Sport has a very separate category in the UK called the International Sport Person Visa.
Oh,
Now,
gotcha. Okay.
for the International Sports Person Visa is also primarily a sponsored work visa. So let's think, if you're going to go and play, I suppose we can't use rugby every single time. If you're going to go and play for Liverpool in the UK, Liverpool needs to essentially sponsor you to come over and play for them. And it's also only for people at the, I don't want to say the pinnacle, but kind of at the more professional levels of their career. I mean, someone who played for, I don't know, Western Province in South Africa can't just go and get outright international sports person visa. It's a few things they need to do, such as governing body endorsement from the UK as well. So, stuff like that.
So would a guy like Wade van Niekerk, the 400-meter world champion, he's an individual athlete. Would he then also qualify under the athlete visa that you were talking of? Look, he doesn't have a team to sponsor him. It's an individual. He's coming to the UK to participate and or train over there. What kind of visa would he then need?
Yeah, look, that's an interesting aspect that you brought up, Leon, because if we look at what someone like a Wade van Niekerk, that's an individual athletic athlete per se, they don't necessarily need a work visa to come to the UK. You do have certain categories under a normal visitor visa that would allow you to do that. Visitor visas, for example, you deal with something that's called permitted activities when you go over on a visitor visa.
Okay, gotcha.
And sports forms a big part of that. You can go to
Gotcha.
the UK and that sort of thing. So that would more or less fall under that category.
I see. Okay, well, a little bit different from how we do things around here, but in some ways very similar as well. So just kind of to calibrate on kind of see how you guys do things a little bit different on your end. You want to talk to us a little bit about the innovator founder visa or
Yeah, absolutely. This is also a very interesting one to me, and a very evolved form of what was previously known as the entrepreneurial visa in the UK. And previously you had an entrepreneur visa where you needed to kind of invest into a business in the UK, create your own business, with much less requirements that we have nowadays. And I think the route where we headed with in terms of these innovative or this innovator route is really going to contribute to the UK economy, but it's still, I must say, it's still a work in progress. The UK has, or the Home Office rather, has changed the rules regarding this type of visa a number of times since it was introduced. But what it essentially is this is a immigration category for entrepreneurs wishing to start their own innovative company in the UK. of course, the UK wants to have that innovation in the UK and try to keep it there and develop it there. Much like the global talent, this is also a two-step process. So the very first process in this is also an endorsement process. You have about 4 endorsement bodies that would evaluate your business plan. Now, this is where this immigration category gets very, very interesting, because that business plan that you present to an endorsement body needs to be spot on. You have several factors that you need to address in that business plan. The most important factors, however, is going to be innovation, viability, and scalability. And when most people and most clients kind of fall short here is the innovation aspect, right? So if we kind of take a step back and we think about innovation, a lot of people would think, oh, that this needs to be the latest AI invention, a flying car, whatever the case might be. But it's not expressed in that. You know, innovation is kind of split into 2 prongs there. It's something that's completely new and unique to the UK, or something that's going to create a competitive market advantage in the UK. And I feel like that is something that a lot of people miss when you don't look into it deep enough, that competitive market advantage aspect. But getting back to the essence of the visa, once this business plan and your financial planning is submitted to the endorsement body, they make a decision. If they feel that your business meets that innovation, viability, and scalability criteria, you receive endorsement from them. And much like the global talent, you then go forth and apply for a visa in your name. I think the main difference between the global talent and the innovative founder, if you want to put it in that way, is global talent is individual based, looks at you as an individual and your talents, whereas the innovative founder looks more at the business. What type of business do you want to bring here? It is a route that provides a expedited settlement route, much like the global talent. But there's a lot of key milestones you need to meet, such as, having to register and develop patents or intellectual property in the UK, investing extra money into your business, that sort of thing.
So is there a minimum investment that you need to invest into your company? And is there a minimum of employees that you need to employ in your company?
Interestingly, only when you want to apply for indefinite leave to remain at the end of the time. So after 3 years, they will then test. Have you employed, I believe it's something like 10 or 20 persons in your business over 3 years? Have you invested £50,000 into your business, which doesn't seem like a lot, but now you also need to take it back and see, where's your funding coming from? Are you funding as an individual? What's the scale of your business? I mean, something like a software company is not, you don't require that much capital up front, but if you're looking at something like getting into manufacturing or something like that, you might need much exponentially more than that.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of those criteria, that you can meet at the end. It's about 10. You generally need to meet 2 for you to be able to apply for your indefinite leave to remain. But upfront, which is an interesting point, upfront, you don't need to prove a set amount of capital, and you don't need to prove any sort of staff complement and stuff. You really need to prove it's viable.
And do you guys have specific business plan writers for these particular visa categories? We have something similar like this for countries that the US have treaties with, and oftentimes, we have these great business plans. These businessmen say we can write a business plan by ourselves, but look, there's a business plan for if you go borrow money for the bank. There's a business plan if you go try to consult your business to an investor who wants to invest in your business. And I tell people there's a business plan for immigration as well. Do you guys provide that service, or do you have someone to provide that business plan service to make sure that it's going to meet that first initial step?
In short, yes. Leon, JP and myself tends to help clients with that quite a lot, and the reason therefore is this is a very specific business plan, as you mentioned. You have different business plans, and you need to address a lot of key factors here. And in dealing with these applications throughout the past 3 to 4 years, and also knowing the in-depth aspects of the law that we need to prove here, we know what to address there. Interesting factor that you also mentioned earlier, one says that everyone's of the opinion I can write a great business plan, or no, I'll just outsource to XYZ company to write a business plan for me. I found that the Home Office and the endorsement body picks up on that like that. If you simply ask someone, go out and write a business plan for me, I'll pay you X amount of money, I need to get to the UK. They pick up on that. They want to see that it's kind of your brainchild. So your influence needs to be very clear in that. All right. So, and I think the reason they look at it like that is they want to avoid someone just effectively buying their way into the UK and having no interest of contributing at all.
Gotcha.
Mhm.
Maybe we can switch over to business mobility. You know, in our field,
Yeah.
it's called the intercompany transfer visa, where you need to have the ability to move some of your key workers in between your branches and affiliates and managers and team members, especially if you're going to be opening up a new operation. Why don't you share with us a little bit about business mobility under the UK immigration?
Yeah, absolutely, Leon. So what we're dealing with here, the category is referred to as global business mobility. And I've noted the 5 options that you have under this category there. Now, what makes global business mobility very interesting, right, is, well, first of all, this is a very, very new route that has been introduced. I believe it's only 2.5 years ago that they've introduced this global business mobility, and they've taken a lot of other routes that doesn't exist anymore and tied it into this. What they're essentially looking for here, we need to have a company outside of the UK, which is their headquarters. All right. So when someone looks at the slides and they see overseas company, I'm referring to a company outside of the UK. Now we have the option to branch out into the UK. And when I mean branching out into the UK, you need to create that branch or subsidiary in the UK and license that branch. We referred to sponsored work a bit earlier, and sponsored work is tied to your company in the UK having a sponsor license to bring over your workers. So in all of these business mobility routes, you first need to apply for that license. But now we kind of branch out and see what types of people you can bring over. The most commonly used one out of all these is the expansion work, and that's the one we deal with the most as well. This is company ABC based in South Africa, wants to go and open a branch in the UK. You know, they've reached their cap in South Africa as to what they can trade. They now want to have access to the UK market. Now we send over one senior worker from the South African entity over to the UK to go and establish that branch. So that's how the expansion work visa works. So that person in his personal capacity will then receive that visa. You can go and open the branch in the UK, work in the UK, but very importantly, after they only grant you a very limited amount of time. You get 1 year on this visa and you can extend for another year. After that, your company needs to be at such a level where you can revert to the normal skilled worker, the sponsor, the work permit that JP referred to earlier. So that's the most common one. The other ones that you see on that list is really ones that it existed in the past in other formats, such as the secondment and the senior and specialist worker. Those were all visas that was intercompany transfer, basically. You know, so if we look at something like a secondment worker, that's typically, you know, your big PwC, Deloitte's sending over someone to the UK to go and perform that specific assignment, specific task for a year or two and come back. Same with the senior and specialist and graduate trainee. You know, it's temporary work assignments. It's not intended to keep you in the UK. That's why you'll also see on my slide there, it does not lead to settlement. That's the only downside in this visa. No matter how long you spend on it, and I believe you can only spend up to 6 years in this route, you can never be granted settlement or indefinitely to remain.
That makes it a little bit concerning. I mean, for a CEO who is establishing this branch over in the UK, never having the ability to actually immigrate his entire family over there permanently.
Yeah, but and that's where it becomes interesting. So, and this is what a lot of people don't know. What you can do if you've established this branch and everything is up and running, company is doing well, then you can quite easily, of course, by meeting certain requirements, swap this sponsor license of yours over to a skilled worker sponsor license, which means you can now essentially move as an expansion worker or senior specialist into skilled worker, and there your time starts towards your indefinite leave to remain. So I believe, you know, business mobility visas or this category was created just to open up, give companies, international companies, the chance to just flourish into the UK. And if it works, you have the additional options.
Sounds good. So a couple of questions that we typically get on these kind of visas is, number one, how much employees do you need to employ if you open up this branch, affiliate subsidiary? And number two, what's the capital that you need to use in order to capitalize the newly formed UK company?
So yeah, first of all, in terms of employees, in short, there's no number that you need to employ or have to have in the UK. All right.
Okay.
That will come into play when you want to switch over this license to be able to sponsor skilled workers and not mobility workers. Once again, no set number, but this needs to make reasonable sense to the UK. One of the requirements that the UK has in a lot of its visas, a lot of its categories, is what they call a genuineness requirement. So they want to see that you genuinely intend to follow what you want to do. They don't want someone to abuse the system just to get into the UK. And you'll find a lot of people come up to that. Just very briefly, in terms of the capital that you need to fund this kind of project, once again, no minimum amount, no set amount that they say, but it needs to make sense. You can't send over an expansion worker, need to pay him X amount of money, but the business is not even funded to that amount.
Yeah,
right.
Gotcha.
Once again, this is where preparation comes in and where you need to tie everything together.
Gotcha. I think, JP, maybe we can conclude our webinar. There's so much very interesting things that I'm learning here today. I briefly mentioned in the US where they don't have the ability to really capture and keep some of these high performing, high academic folks in the US, and they are all just kind of left to some kind of a lottery. Why don't you talk to us a little bit about how the UK is capturing these high potential, you guys call it a high potential individual. I love it.
Yeah, I think, Dirk, if you want to very briefly just run through this with us very briefly.
Yeah, absolutely. And I can make this very brief. High potential individual, also a very new visa that was created. And it was kind of created to bring overseas educated talent to the UK. It's a visa that you basically need to study at the top universities in the world. And when I say top universities in the world, there's a very specific list of universities that you had to have studied to be able to get this visa. And it's heavily dominated by the US. I mean, it's most typically your Yales, your Harvards, and that sort of thing. You need to be studied there. Get your degree, bachelor's level or above. Then you kind of get this format of a post-study worker where you can utilize this, come to the UK for 2 years, work in any field you want, work without sponsorship, bring your family with for that 2 years if you want to. But then they cap you. After 2 years, you either need to get sponsorship or you need to go back. So it kind of ties in, Leon, with what you said earlier about your system in the US, where you study there, you get the short window, but then what? So that's also where the high potential individual stops in the UK.
I think that's a great way to attract, talent from not just the UK, but in the US, but from all over the world. I like the idea that it's graduates from top international universities. I mean, I can only imagine if the US could do something similar like that, where not only if they're able to keep those that they educate over here, but even maybe get some guys from Oxford or Cambridge over there and have them come over here as well. Well, gentlemen, we don't have a lot of questions from our audience, but what I'm going to do is we are going to get this video kind of cleaned up. And for those of you who are listening, for those of you who missed it, but what's going to happen is we will send this video to those who have signed up, and also put an information on there on how to get in contact with JP and or Dirk with regards to some questions that you have in immigrating to the US. Maybe just some closing remarks. Let's start with you, JP, or Dirk, and then we'll wrap it up from after that.
Yeah, thank you, Leon. I think I'd just like to mention, I just had a quick look. There's 20 US universities. I think it's the most of any country on this HPI, this high potential individual route. This is quite substantial. By far and away the most of any other country. So it's interesting. No, thank you for the opportunity. I think, UK immigration law policy is ever changing, keeps us on our toes. I think it's important for potential migrants and clients to just never panic. I think it's a rule in life. Everybody should do, just don't panic. If you've got any questions, just, ask, reach out, we can deal with it, whatever it might be. And everybody must feel free. If we can help, we'd be very happy to do so.
Dirk, any final comments on your end?
Yeah, nothing very further from me, Leon. I just think thank you for the opportunity to be able to speak here on your platform. Like JP said, it's important to keep calm with these sort of things. A lot of people become really overwhelmed when you read an online blog or a Facebook post about what happened to someone. Those things happen. There are ways to fix it, but best bet is to do it right from the start.
Thank you, gentlemen. I think a great initial consultation is always the best way to kind of figure out what the plan is moving forward, and then figuring out a way to implement that plan and talk about timelines. Gentlemen, it was a pleasure visiting with you guys on a platform where oftentimes we'll do this in private. We got the benefit of having a little audience here, and we'll share this with those who couldn't join us today. Again, thank you so much until we meet up on the next tape.